Welcome back, everyone. Tonight, we will step into the life of a character that history often forgets, the European peasant of the Middle Ages. Not kings, not knights, but ordinary people who tilled the land, fought against famine, disease, harsh weather, and somehow kept the whole society alive. Their lives were not glorious, and sometimes even so tragic that you might wonder how they could endure year after year. And before we dive into their meals, hardships, and the strange things they had to face, remember to like the video and subscribe to the channel if you want to join me in exploring more unique historical stories. Don't forget to leave a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is. I really enjoy seeing our community grow all around the world. Stay until the end of the video because you'll be surprised to learn about the unusual foods that kept all of Europe alive for centuries. After swallowing a challenging breakfast that tested their mental strength, the medieval peasant began the rest of the morning, a journey that stretched from fatigue to exhaustion and back to a higher level of tiredness. And if breakfast was a flavorful opening for the whole day, then fieldwork was the declaration of fate, where you realize that the land is never your friend. It is a silent, wet, persistent enemy, and it has absolutely no intention of helping you survive. Imagine stepping out of a dilapidated wooden house where every plank creaks as if it were trying to file for retirement. The morning air is chilly, but not the kind that wakes you up. This is the kind of cold that a peasant feels deep in the bones, as if their ancestors are shivering at the same time. But no one has time to care about the cold. Work is calling, the fields are waiting, livestock are screaming, and life is ready to snatch away any small joy you might still have. Your workday begins with soil, lots of soil, wet soil, dry soil, soil hard as rock, soil soft as mud. That soil sticks to your hands, your feet, your clothes, and your whole life. If you were a medieval peasant, the land was your involuntary spouse. And like any toxic relationship, the land gives just enough for you to survive, but takes back so much that you cannot walk away. Your tools are nothing beautiful or shiny like in a museum. Most of them are handed down through generations, that is, through enough years for any metal object to look like a piece of iron taken from the corpse of an old dragon. Blunt plow blades, bent hose, rotting wooden handles, and every swing is a reminder that the technology of the time was not on the side of the poor. But you still have to use them, because the only other choice is to starve, and starving in the Middle Ages was a rather common lifestyle. Plowing the fields is not just plowing. It is where patience is tested. You dig endless rows of land while the sun rises and sweat pours down enough to pickle yourself. Every step is a negotiation, continue or give up, and the answer is always continue, not because you are resilient, but because the Lord does not care how you feel. The fields must be plowed, seeds must be sown, and the harvest waits for no one. At this point, sometimes the peasant would have a small snack, but snack here does not resemble any modern concept. No granola bars, no whole grain bread, no energy-rich dried fruits. A snack is simply anything you can shove into your pocket without dying, and that won't kill you within 3 hours. A raw onion is a classic choice. People in the Middle Ages ate onions as modern people eat snacks, with a resigned face and underlying sadness. Onions were cheap, easy to grow, and capable of extinguishing any hope that you might have pleasant breath in your lifetime. By mid-morning, work shifted to tending the livestock. If you think animals were a source of comfort, you have overestimated the pleasantness of medieval cows, goats, and pigs. They were dirty, noisy, and always seemed to be plotting to kill you in your sleep. They squealed for food, dragged chains, ran amok, and if you were not careful, a boar could gore you hard enough for you to see the future, a future where you are still a peasant and still dissatisfied. After finishing with the animals, the peasant returned to the fields, the garden, or any task imposed by the season. This work repeated day after day, week after week, year after year. The Middle Ages had no days off, no weekends, no self-care. The only thing they had was an endless workload and the faint hope that the weather would not ruin everything. Sadly, the weather almost always ruined everything. Summer was too hot. Winter was like it wanted to kill the whole village. Spring was wet and muddy. Autumn brought a sense of despair because it was when you realized you were about to face long-lasting cold and a granary slowly emptying day by day. After abandoning all hope that meat would become a regular part of their diet, the medieval peasant returned to the harsh truth. Protein was not a right, but a rare miracle, occurring as infrequently as a solar eclipse. When they said, "Today we eat meat," they usually meant, "I found something that looks like it used to be an animal." For many, it was just bones, a cooking tool more than an ingredient. Bones were simmered in a pot for hours, sometimes days, to try to extract a few tiny nutrients left from the animal's short life. When you drank medieval bone broth, you were consuming the spirit of the animal, not the meat. And eggs? They were treasures. One egg was worth several hours of labor, and sometimes it was the only thing standing between you and hunger. Peasants knew this so well that they rarely touched their own eggs. An egg was used for trade, paying taxes, or impressing neighbors on significant occasions, such as a visitor comes. Eating it? No, only if you truly hated your own future. That is why, when it came to protein, the medieval peasant immediately thought of fish, not the fatty, fresh, omega 3 rich fish of modern advertisements. Their fish came from two sources: a nearby stream where the fish were tiny and eager to die, or a barrel of salted fish where the fish had long been dead and still seemed keen to die again. Salted fish were preserved so thoroughly that you had to soak them in water for hours just to make them resemble something less like a brick flavored with the sea. When you cooked it, the smell filled the small house so completely that even the spirits of your ancestors would recognize it. But even that terrible fish was more precious than self-sourced protein: insects. They didn't hunt them, but if any fell into the stew while cooking, it was considered a sign of luck. Peasants wasted no food, even unsolicited food. This wasn't too bad, as sometimes these tiny guests added a bit of flavor that the stew otherwise lacked. But endurance came not only from food, it also came from drink. Clean water was a strange concept, so they drank small beer, a beverage so weak that you needed 3 cups just to start tasting it. But at least it was safe. Sometimes they drank a cider or weak mead, but those were usually reserved for the wealthier rather than peasants. For them, small beer was the flow of life, the only thing keeping them upright when their meal could not. And dinner was not meant to be enjoyed. It was merely stuffing a little something into yourself before collapsing without the strength to rise again. Sometimes they had a thick porridge made from oats or barley, cooked long enough to become a mixture that was edible while helping forget a little. Dinner might come with a bit of old crumbled bread or some hard vegetables, as rigid as the church's morals, boiled to avoid breaking teeth. But the most important thing was, it was enough to survive the night. And despite deprivation, hardship, and never eating to fullness by modern standards, the medieval peasant still lived, still worked, and somehow still fed an entire continent. When dinner ended and the potage officially entered a state of temporary leave, the medieval peasant moved to the final stage of the day's culinary cycle: preparing for tomorrow, by pretending tomorrow did not exist. Because, honestly, for them, food was not a pleasure, but a constant battle against hunger, failed crops, and a universe seemingly intent on proving that humans are the weakest creatures on Earth. But as unbelievable as it may seem, there were small moments, not happiness, but a pause in punishment. At those times, peasants could sense that food was not necessarily the enemy. Occasionally, very occasionally, nature granted them a gift: an onion not yet nibbled by wild animals, a loaf of bread still intact, a vegetable growing despite the weather tormenting the land. These moments were so rare that they were remembered as major events, sometimes even passed down orally in the village as if they were miracles. But the most beautiful moment of their week came from something that modern people rarely think about: freshly baked bread. Not the golden, soft, buttery bread of today. Medieval bread was as hard as the morality of monks. If you threw it against a wall, you might injure yourself. Yet for peasants, bread still represented life. It was the foundation of every meal, something they could take to the fields without it spoiling immediately. To make it, they had to grind the grain, knead the dough with exhausted hands, and bake it in an earthen oven with so little firewood that they often only baked when they could share it with the whole village. The hardness of the bread could loosen teeth, but it was part of life. And if you soaked it long enough in the potage, you had a dish that modern people would call rustic cuisine. a romanticization utterly unacceptable to those who truly ate it. But even bread was not always available. When crops failed, the whole village had to share black loaves mixed with anything that could stretch, bran husks, roots, even dust from grinding stones. In some years, records show that the bread contained so many grit particles that people had to crush each piece with a stone before biting, not to soften the bread, but to avoid losing their teeth. And when it came to creativity, no one was more inventive than peasants in solving breakfast. Medieval breakfast was not eggs, bacon, or oatmeal porridge as in films. It was whatever was left from last night. Yes, pottage, round three. Lunch was not much better. Usually just a small piece of hard cheese rubbing against itself in a cloth bag, or some cold porridge poured into a crude bowl. In reality, lunch was meant to restore energy, but it entirely lacked the strength required. That contradiction is the very definition of medieval peasant life. But dinner was a different story. Not because it was tastier, but because it was the only moment the whole family sat together. Nothing luxurious, nothing elaborate, but within that meal was something that wealth could not always buy: unity. Yet when night fell, peasants knew all too well what awaited them tomorrow: an endless loop of work, hunger, and the faint hope that the fields would not betray them. When the last children finally fell asleep, the adults looked at each other through the dying firelight. No words, no complaints, only the understanding that they had to continue. Because in their world, food was not a pastime, it was a duty, it was survival. If there's one thing that modern people find hardest to imagine about life in the Middle Ages, it is how peasants had to constantly negotiate with nature just to survive until the next meal. No refrigerator, no oven, no restaurants to grab a bite to stave off hunger. All they had was the land, the weather, and a persistent will to survive so strong that even they sometimes could not explain it. And the frightening part is, for peasants, survival was not a destination but a full-time job, happening every day, every hour, with no days off. Their yearly food supply was divided into two phases: the temporary peace phase right after the harvest, and the remaining period known by unofficial names such as empty belly months, season of despair, or simply, "Oh Lord, why does it keep being like this?" After the harvest, meals were slightly richer, just a little, like thicker pottage, a few more yellow turnips, and sometimes, if luck visited, a scrap of game meat accidentally dropped along the way. But just a few weeks later, that fragile abundance vanished faster than faith in the weather. Peasants understood a harsh truth: food was never as it seemed. In this context, food preservation was almost an art for those always living on the edge. No one wanted to eat a piece of meat as hard as stone, but everyone wanted to live. So they hung, salted, hid, buried, prayed. Every method was a gamble. And the truth was, if something smelled strange, peasants did not grimace for long. As long as it did not move fast enough to escape being caught, it was still considered part of the meal. The older the food, the more creativity the peasant had to use. Pottage, the iconic dish of the peasant class, was a combination of whatever was left in the kitchen: vegetables, grains, leaves, sometimes something else unidentifiable. The recipe was never fixed, because the truth was no one wanted to keep the recipe to make it a second time. It was a soup of hope, where each spoonful was a mix of pride, resignation, and a bit of fear. All of this meant that every meal carried a story of endurance. Morning was a slow beginning. Noon was replenishment, and evening was the moment the peasant acknowledged that they had survived another day. No one called it a victory, but in their hearts, it was the closest thing to a championship they could achieve. When darkness fell and the village sank into silence, peasants also sank into sleep with stomachs never truly full. They slept because there was nothing left to do, because their bodies demanded rest, because tomorrow would be a new battle. And though they would never admit it, that sleep always carried a tiny hope: the hope that tomorrow would be more generous than today. Perhaps the most perplexing thing when reading these notes is not the detail of Marco Polo, but the way they reveal a mechanism of power that even official histories describe in only a few dry lines. In the world of the Yuan dynasty harem, everything had rules, sometimes written, mostly unwritten, and Marco seemed to understand them intuitively, as if he had lived among those women long enough to recognize the silent rhythm that governed every step in the palace. He wrote that on many windless nights, he could see shapes moving like water behind the silk curtains. His description did not resemble that of a merchant observing from afar, but of someone standing right by the corridor, only a few steps away from touching the cold stone floor of the palace. Those figures, according to his suggestion, were not merely strolling. They were performing their roles in a sophisticated network where every glance, every hand movement could signal advancement or a silent sentence. This strangely coincides with rumors circulating among the Yuan Chinese nobility about female attendants whose task was to adjust emotions within the palace. History has never recorded exactly how they existed, but Marco revealed details that only others would know, such as the fact that they were not allowed to wear perfume, not allowed to wear bright clothing, and always stepped half a beat slower than others. That was the rhythm of an observer, not a competitor. According to him, there were always three things in the harem that anyone living there understood clearly: favor, fear, and presence. He described a secret ritual occurring at the start of each season, where the highest ranking concubines were allowed to select three young women for training, not to serve the emperor, but to serve themselves. Those chosen would learn to read another concubine's facial expressions merely through her gaze. Marco wrote that they were taught to hear what no one said and see what no one wanted to see. Such a description truly went far beyond the perspective of a traveler, but it is precisely in these small details that Marco inadvertently recorded the most dangerous truth. The harem system did not rely on rules, but on the balance of fear. He concluded a passage with a haunting sentence: "In the harem, power does not lie in the hands of those chosen by the emperor, but in the hands of those who know whom the emperor will choose next." That was not the sentence of a merchant, not of a storyteller, but of someone who had stepped into a world he should not have entered and survived to tell the tale. If the preparation rituals of the concubines were a silent dance, then the corridor leading to the emperor's chamber was where that dance reached its climax. Marco described it as a narrow path where every breath carries fate. Thick curtains hung down, lantern light casting a hazy layer over everyone's faces, making each step feel like crossing into another world, where unwritten rules decided who would be remembered and who would vanish from the story by nightfall. He recounted that there were always three layers of inspection before a concubine was allowed into a private chamber. The first layer for the smallest mistakes: a stray hair, a misaligned scent, a fleeting expression of regret when looking back at where her friends stood. They were trained not to look back, but Marco wrote that sometimes he still saw someone's eyes trying to hold on to something already gone. The powerful women of the palace never overlooked such moments of weakness. The second layer of inspection, according to him, was the test of emptiness. Not everyone could pass. A concubine was not allowed to bring any personal thought into the emperor's chamber. This may sound simple, but it was the most difficult thing. Marco described their faces as breathing statues, beautiful but distant, alive but forbidden to show emotion. This was not mere obedience, but an art taught over many years. Anyone who revealed their mind, even for a moment, was discarded like a loose thread on a brocade. It was not only the women who captivated Marco's observation. He devoted a long section to men no longer belonging to the world of men, silent guards who wielded power far beyond their modest appearance. Marco called them by the ancient name keepers of the soul's gate. This may sound literary, but it accurately reflected their role. They did not only guard the physical doors, but also the doors of information, rumors, and the destiny of every woman in the palace. Most terrifying of all were the notes on the final procedure before a concubine was taken into the emperor's chamber. Marco described the unxi using a silk cloth to lightly touch her hands, neck, and back, not for cleaning, but to check for traces. "The skin is a book," he wrote. "It always records what it has touched." An unauthorized touch, even accidental, was enough to silently topple an entire family outside the palace. For if her feet touched the ground, it meant she had stood somewhere, walked somewhere that the palace did not permit, and that was unacceptable. What makes medieval records of the harem terrifying is not what was written down, but what no one dared to write. Those who lived there did not exist as historical figures, but as shadows sculpted by expectations, rituals, and prejudices. The harem was not merely a place where women were confined to entertain the Son of Heaven. It was a political mechanism operating by suffocating freedom and inflating competition to a metaphysical level. You did not need enemies in such a structure. The system created them on its own. Silence was the main language in this place, but it was not the empty silence that a monk seeks in meditation. It was a dense silence, heavy like incense smoke, full of implication, and always on the verge of being misunderstood. A slight bow could be interpreted as submission or sarcasm. A word spoken at the right moment could open a whole season of grace. Another word, repeated with the wrong tone to the wrong person at the wrong time, could become an invisible blade cutting into a woman's fate for years. Night in Baghdad was not merely a period of time, it was a parallel world, where every sense was awakened to perceive hidden secrets that daylight never revealed. When the first oil lamps flickered over the old rooftops and arched windows, the city seemed to awaken from the short slumber of the day. A gentle breeze from the Tigris carried the scent of resin, flower pollen, and meat roasting with spices, weaving through narrow alleys, beckoning everyone outside like a wordless soundtrack guiding wandering footsteps. The streets transformed into a continuously moving stage. Lantern bearers moved like dancers among amber and ruby red lights, leaving behind a thin halo that was enough to make hearts skip a beat. Each lamp was not just a source of light, they were miniature stars, illuminating the path for curious steps and sparking the imagination of anyone passing by. Children ran after them, giggling as their shadows danced on the walls, while the elderly quietly watched, recalling similar nights of the past when everything was still pristine and magical like a silent dream. The night markets were not simply places of trade, they were labyrinths of scent and sound, where every sense was invited to participate in a subtle play. The aroma of cinnamon, nutmeg, saffron, and frankincense blended into a fragrant map guiding pedestrians as if every breath told a story. Carefully arranged stalls, tall lantern posts, and vibrant rugs created a space both real and illusory, where the line between sight and imagination blurred. Every stall, from ceramics to dyes, from precious herbs to freshly copied books, told a story of where they came from, who had touched them, and the dreams they carried. Sound formed the second layer of the labyrinth. The clinking of candy trays, the plucking of strings from traveling musicians, vendors calling out prices in melodic rhythms, all merged into a lively symphony. Yet there were quieter, subtler sounds. The turning of pages as a scholar examined an ancient manuscript, the soft slicing of roasted lamb, the labored breathing of a sailor freshly returned from months at sea. They reminded everyone that night in Baghdad was not merely for amusement. It was where stories from everywhere met and layered upon each other. Night commerce was an art, both sophisticated and alluring. Spice merchants did not merely arrange goods, they created living portraits of scent, guiding pedestrians through layers of fragrance as if through magical doors. Cinnamon, star anise, frankincense, pepper, herbs from India, Persia, Yemen, and distant lands were blended with artisanal skill. Each scent a bridge between past and present, distant and near. A pinch of fragrance could lead to a tea house, where poets recited verses, or to a gathering of Sufi musicians immersed in melody, and sometimes to mysterious tales from the coasts of Gujarat or the Sahara. In the night market, every step was a discovery, and every feather, every spice grain was an invitation into another world. The people of Baghdad learned to live in the rhythm of the night. Scholars left the House of Wisdom, debating over cups of mint tea, while sailors from far-off trade routes sought commercial information and befriended local merchants. Artisans, from glassmakers to woodworkers, turned their craft into a performance. A glass vase illuminated under a lantern was no longer a vase but a gem radiating brilliance, captivating the eye and creating an imaginative space for anyone nearby. As the night grew denser and the rhythm of Baghdad's night market reached its peak, the street corners transformed into vibrant labyrinths where every sense was both challenged and enchanted. Envoys, merchants, and travelers from around the world merged into the dense flow of people, creating an unceasing current through the winding alleys. Lacquerware from China shone like water, reflecting the light from the lanterns, making the stalls appear to float above the ground. The fortunate ones could hear tales of distant cities where fireworks dazzled so brilliantly that even Baghdad at night seemed humbled. But it was not only goods or material things. Each person carried stories, memories, and hopes, turning the streets into a miniature universe where cultures and languages met. Arabic, Persian, Greek, Turkic, Swahili, and sometimes even Chinese sounded simultaneously, like a symphony of humanity. Baghdad's night market was a place where status and origin became meaningless. A fisherman on the Tigris could walk hand in hand beside a wealthy merchant with caravans from Damascus or Samak, and both would be welcomed equally. Commerce and culture intertwined, forming invisible yet strong bonds. Stories were exchanged, goods bought and sold, all weaving a living network where social, economic, and intellectual connections developed simultaneously. Darkness did not silence the world. On the contrary, it gathered the world together, turning every step into the market into a journey of discovery. The storytellers, or hakawatis, were the soul of the night. Circles of audiences gathered around them. Children sat wide-eyed, adults lingered at the edges, yet could not look away. The stories blended mythology, history, and imagination, taking the crowd from deserts with Sinbad to ruined relics, or small boats weaving through slums. Each storyteller added or subtracted details, turning the stories into a vivid experience, never the same twice. Even Sufi mystics moved among the crowd, chanting sacred love poems, spinning in circles, casting shadows and motion across the market floor, making Baghdad's night both sacred and mystical, part festival, part ritual. The corners of the market were not only for commerce or entertainment, they were improvisational academies. Philosophers, mathematicians, astronomers, and scholars from the House of Wisdom engaged in debate circles amidst the crowd. They discussed astronomy, mathematics, medicine, philosophy, and sometimes mundane matters, always with fervor. A mathematician might debate a physician on the nature of infinity, while a historian commented on ancient Persian history, and a teenager reciting al-Mutanabi's poetry left everyone astonished. Night in Baghdad was a university without walls, where learning became a festival, and anyone could participate, even if only through gaze, gesture, or an encouraging smile. Nighttime cuisine was also an essential part. Stalls with sizzling skewers of lamb, onions, and parsley, seasoned delicately, drizzled with lemon, wrapped in warm bread, became a popular dinner for both scholars and laborers. Large copper pots of lentils, chickpeas, and stews smoked heavily, spiced with cinnamon, pepper, garlic, and sometimes dried lemon for a tangy flavor, attracting long queues of eager customers. Confectioners became the artisans of the market. Dates stuffed with almonds, pastries covered in sesame, honey-fried dough, and rose candies, all accompanied by the sound of syrup dripping, forcing every passerby to pause. Children tugged at their parents' hands, adults pretended to buy one item but returned many times, all forming a living dessert-like performance. Moreover, the deeper, more hidden corners of the market, under the dim glow of smaller lamps, held other secrets and vitality. Herbalists, pharmacists, mystics, and fortune tellers combined medicine, superstition, and ancient tradition, creating a layer of mystique where passersby could find both cures and magical stories. This was the silent heartbeat of Baghdad, where nocturnal life was truly made, profound and multifaceted, far surpassing what the glaring daylight could ever reveal. At 17, Caesar stood in the midst of a storm that even many adults would struggle to face. The sudden loss of his father left the once imposing Uli household fragile and full of traps, where every smile hid worry, every piece of advice carried risk. Rome under Lucius Cornelius Sulla was not a place to live without calculation. Survival every minute was controlled by a man of iron, where the prestige and lives of the nobility hung precariously on the balance of fear. Caesar keenly felt that his father's former protection had vanished, leaving a gap that every rival sought to exploit. Every action of his was now scrutinized. Every step could become a path leading to danger. Each passing day, Caesar learned to listen more than speak. Gentle footsteps through the Uli atrium became lessons in observation: who bowed to whom, who avoided whose gaze, who concealed a smile or a worry. Every word, every action of his relatives was analyzed like pieces of a puzzle that, if one piece were wrong, could cause the entire picture to collapse. From his mother, Aurelia, Caesar learned steel-like composure. She was both a guide and a shield, and also the one maintaining the family's survival. Through her gestures, he understood that strength did not always lie in outward power, but sometimes in patience, in silent observation, and in small yet precise decisions. But the loss of his father did not only mature Caesar intellectually, it ignited a fire of ambition. He was no longer a sheltered adolescent. Now he had to find a way to stand firm in a city full of danger. Family alliances, once Uli's pride, became political traps. The engagement to Cornelia, daughter of, say, one of Sulla's most formidable opponents, immediately made Caesar a potential target. In a Rome full of watching eyes and hidden knives and sleeves, the existence of a family tied to an enemy was a threat. Mornings in the Uli household were no longer filled with carefree laughter. Every ritual, every meal, every step within the house carried weighty calculation and caution. Slaves and servants moved carefully, every sound potentially attracting the attention of guests or relatives. And amid all the whispers, Caesar learned to walk the edge between power and life, not only to survive, but to understand the world he lived in and the limits others imposed upon him. Yet, amid the tremendous pressure, Caesar discovered an inner strength. His steadfastness in keeping Cornelia, even at the risk of his life, was his first demonstration of resistance to political and social pressure. Without fanfare or performance, he refused quietly but firmly, letting observers sense the power of his will. A teenager, not yet in real power, had learned that courage sometimes meant holding one's ground when everything around seemed to collapse. Day by day, month by month, Caesar honed his skills of observation, analysis, and human assessment, skills that would later become the foundation of his political career. Every conversation within the family, every meeting with allies or potential rivals became lessons in strategy, intrigue, and understanding human psychology. He learned not only to avoid danger, but to recognize opportunity, the gaps in power, the weaknesses of the proud, and the loopholes in Roman law and custom. These lessons, combined with loss and challenge, shaped a Caesar who early on realized that power does not come naturally. It must be created, protected, and sometimes seized through intelligence and persistence. And from his youth, he sensed that in Rome, a small decision could change the course of life. Even one misplaced step, one poorly timed word, could be the start of disaster or glory. In the context of Sulla's Rome, Caesar gradually recognized a profound truth. Survival and power meant understanding both others and oneself, and knowing when to act and when to wait. Ambition was born from weakness, determination from loss, and strength from observation. These were the first lessons on the path to becoming a leader, not only intelligent, but adept at using circumstance. At 17, Caesar was no longer the boy following in his father's shadow. He had begun stepping onto the political stage, where every gaze, every gesture, and every decision could alter fate. Thus, those early years, though filled with pain and danger, forged a Caesar not easily subdued. Loss became motivation. Fear became an opportunity to cultivate resilience. Sulla's Rome was a relentless trial, but Caesar learned to walk through the storm, not merely to survive, but to lay the foundations for the power and influence he would later wield. Amid threats and upheaval, a young leader began to take shape. Quiet, resolute, and ambitious, a Caesar Rome would never forget. During his months in exile, Caesar was no longer the boy hunted by Sulla. Each morning, as dawn broke, he stepped out of his tent, a pack on his back, his feet pressing onto gravel, still cold from the night. The sound of his footsteps mingled with the calls of forest birds and the wind sweeping across the barren fields. Every moment was a lesson, every decision a training. Caesar learned to recognize danger from the smallest signs, a shadow moving at a distance, a strange sound in the night, or simply the sudden silence of a bird's song. This heightened awareness not only helped him survive, but also began to shape the nature of a future commander, one capable of sensing the enemy before they even appeared. On the hills and valleys of Asia Minor, Caesar faced war not as an abstract idea or theoretical lesson, but as a living, fierce, chaotic, and compelling force. Ambushes by local tribes, sudden and dangerous skirmishes taught him practically that victory depended not only on strength or numbers, but also on alertness, adaptability, and courage. The first time he carried the Eagle standard, charging straight into the enemy through smoke, fire, and screams, Caesar acted not for glory, but out of awareness that the lives of his comrades and himself were at stake in every step. That daring action, combined with decisiveness and leadership, caused the legion to rally around him, the enemy to crumble, and senior officers to take notice of a teenager not yet 18. Every day, Caesar observed, learned, and experimented. He paid attention to how officers planned patrols, how they negotiated with local kings or rebellious tribes. In every negotiation, he learned the subtle rules of diplomacy: when to bow, when to yield, when to assert authority. He absorbed skill in speech, subtlety in action, and patience in waiting for the right moment. A refugee adolescent without rank or power was gradually accumulating skills that many nobles would never learn in a lifetime. Caesar's charisma also began to emerge, a natural but potent magnetism. He knew how to encourage his comrades with sincere words, acknowledge others' efforts, quietly forgive mistakes, and never take credit that was not his. The blend of humility and confidence, courage and intelligence made soldiers feel reassured and eager to follow. Gradually, veteran officers also began to watch him, not only for bravery, but for the intelligence and exceptional situational awareness he displayed. Caesar's strategic ability grew increasingly sharp. He studied maps, analyzed terrain, observed enemy tactics, and calculated every move of his troops. On one patrol, he discovered an ambush before the enemy struck, saving his comrades from massacre and earning high praise from his commanders. These small but decisive victories spread through the camp, and the reputation of a young fugitive began to grow. Caesar was no longer merely surviving, he was becoming a leader, even at a young age. Exile transformed Caesar from a fearful boy into a strong, sharp, and resolute teenager. War taught him the value of strength, observation, courage, and intelligence. The army taught him discipline, loyalty, camaraderie, and the natural magnetism of a leader. Asia Minor, with its rugged and harsh landscape, became a more vivid classroom than any teacher or book in Rome. And even amid hardship, Caesar learned that survival was not just luck, it was the result of intellect, courage, and the ability to adapt quickly. When Caesar set foot back in Rome, he was no longer the exiled teenager pursued by Sulla. The city he had once feared, once regarded as a trap, now appeared through the eyes of someone who had endured war, diplomacy, and survival challenges. Every street corner, every square reminded him of his youth and the fears he had endured. But this time, Caesar walked with a different confidence. Confidence forged through experience, through fire and blood, and through lessons that could not be found in any book. Rome was still dangerous, but Caesar had learned to read the signs, to recognize threats in whispered words and hidden glances. From the very first days, he began observing. He walked through the neighborhoods where factions still competed for power, listening to debates in councils and taverns. He saw clearly the instability of the Republic, generals who had once been heroes of Rome now secretly vying for power, elderly officials disputing land and wealth, and ordinary citizens still suffering fear, oppression, and injustice. In Caesar's eyes, Rome was not a grand city of marble walls and magnificent temples. Rome was a sophisticated political battlefield where the wise and brave would survive, and the weak would be crushed. Officers and veterans who had met him in Asia Minor still remembered Caesar's unusual magnetism. They noticed that the teenager had now become a man with natural authority, not authority granted by family fame, but authority built from courage, skill, and an understanding of human psychology. In these first meetings, Caesar began applying the diplomatic lessons he had learned from kings, judges, and philosophers in Asia Minor. He knew how to ask questions to uncover motives, how to persuade others with gentle yet firm words, and when necessary, to exert power to compel attention. These skills not only helped him reintegrate into Roman society, but gradually allowed him to gain real influence. Caesar began to notice that even the most powerful figures were affected by those around them. A timely suggestion, a subtle action, could change the course of an important decision. He learned to wield this subtlety, making it a hallmark of his leadership style. Gentle authority without lacking decisiveness, compelling yet not easily deceived. At the same time, Caesar retained the instincts of a soldier. The experiences of combat and survival in Asia Minor never left his mind. When he witnessed conflicts in the city, from factional skirmishes to intricate political schemes, he knew how to assess risks and benefits, just as he would when standing amidst an ambush in the hills and plains. Combining military experience with political acumen, Caesar gradually created a rare advantage: the ability to see the big picture while maintaining control over details. Rome also posed a psychological challenge. Caesar realized that his past, as a teenager fleeing from Sulla, could become either a barrier or a weapon. He decided to turn it into part of his story, a testament to endurance and perseverance. His return was not merely a physical journey from Asia Minor to Rome, it was a journey proving that one who had been hunted could now become a force not to be underestimated. Caesar walked among colleagues, officials, and even those who had doubted him, with the confidence of someone who had faced battle and emerged victorious, and with intelligence honed from years of careful observation. Every step, every encounter was an opportunity to learn. He listened to stories about powerful families, past conspiracies, victories and failures in Roman domestic affairs. He observed the attitudes of rich and poor, soldiers and civilians, to understand how social strata interacted and how loyalty was formed or destroyed. Every small experience was stored and analyzed, preparing for a long-term plan only he could see in full. Returning to Rome also made Caesar face a profound reality. The city had never belonged to any single individual. Power was not just a title, it was a complex network of influence, fear, and favor. Caesar realized that to navigate Rome, he needed to use everything he had learned: courage from the battlefield, diplomatic skill from Asia Minor, political acumen, and his natural charisma. All of these elements combined to create a mature, sharp, and ambitious Caesar, a man no longer afraid but capable of using fear to lead. As his early years in exile came to an end, Caesar stood on the streets of Rome with all the experience he had gathered. He had returned not only with opportunity but with a strong identity: a survivor, a student of war and diplomacy, someone who understood human psychology and the true power of authority. Rome, once a trap, now became the stage upon which Caesar was ready to write his own story. And in his heart, every lesson, every battle, every night spent fleeing through the mountains and forests of Asia Minor became fuel for the ambition and power to come as the exiled teenager stepped onto the path to undeniable greatness.